talk about printing and type and a little different things like that. But as in many areas of what we enjoy today, the Chinese were the first to get involved in printing with wood blocks and even movable type. They started off, because they had wood blocks, I think, they started off with wooden type, movable type, but it just didn't work very well. It wasn't, I don't think, the material of wood held the ink like they supposed it would, and it was easy to damage. And they gradually shifted to making clay type, which then fired, which I don't know if it got to the level of being ceramic or not, but it was hard enough to withstand and to actually be movable type. But they did not do a tremendous amount of printing because, I mean, it was pretty rudimentary. I mean, I think they arranged it where they could apply ink to it and then press paper down to it and have what was printed, but they didn't really go into mass circulation or mass production of printed materials. They were more or less, little brief things. And so, of course, that technology, if you want to call it that, eventually evolved to Europe and Germany, and a blacksmith named Gutenberg somehow got the idea that he could make a printing press, and he was successful. And of course, and then the type had been turned into a metal, basis, and he printed the first Bible. So after that, those were the two high points of technology up to the point. And lithography, which is actually the modern day basis for offset printing, occurred somewhere in the 1790s or 1800s, where someone took tallow or grease or animal fat and applied it to a stone surface, and then treated it with water and some kind of gum that did not wash away the tallow or the grease, the fat, whatever, but allowed the ink, kept the rest of it clean, so that ink only stuck to the tallow, and then one sheet at a time put it on. And so, based on the theory of oil and water do not mix, and that's the basis of offset printing to this very day. So anyway, and it looks like if Gutenberg had any longevity to him, if he'd have walked into the Echo in 1955, Dad would have given him a job, because he basically knew the principles that were still involved in printing in that time. It was type high. It was you read type upside down and backwards when you were setting type out of a font, a California type font like this. Of course, these are large letters, and easy to see. And you had stuff that was 8, 9 point, which was used to set type from probably the early 1800s or late 1700s up until the linotype came into existence in 1884, I think, is when Mergenthaler invented the linotype. But and then the Echo got a linotype in 1917. So that meant previous, from the first 30 years or whatever, 35 years, that somebody had to set virtually every written word that had been written that week into one letter at a time in individual letters and a hand stick. I don't know if y'all can see, but this here is a hand stick. Point that out. This is what that is right there. That's a hand stick. And so you would sit in front. That's good. I think that would sit in front of a cabinet of typefaces and have pulled out one with had the typeface you were trying to set in, and set it upside down and backwards. So it's sort of hard 3, but I blame that and the fact that I had to melt lead and smell lead fumes for my brain damage to this day. So, but anyway, on the technology, like a lot of technology, just hardly changed, but I don't guess 3 or 4 major times since things got started in the 1100s until you hit the late 1960s, and they had advanced the lithographic method of not oil and water not mixing until offset printing, high-end offset printing, and offset presses, web presses, and all of a sudden it was a whole new game. But so we'll go from the 1970s to 2020 a little bit later on. But also going back in pictures were just a very uncommon feature of newspapers, up until into the 1960s, but previously to that, Tom, all the old newspapers are right here. I don't know, Tom, can you hold up one of those and look, so people can look. This is what a typical newspaper looked from 100 years ago. I think that was in the 1920s. It's for being 100 years old, it's in pretty good shape. But when Tom picked it up for me out of the Echo and walked outside and the wind started blowing, bits and pieces of it crumbled off the edges. And of course, the ones we got that are from the 1880s are in much worse, shape. 40 years older than that are in much worse shape than that. But so. I lost my train of thought, got derailed there just a little bit. Maybe I can get back on track.
Not many photos.
The first published date was 1870?
1874. But, and the newspaper was started by Larry Gant, who had a terrible hobby of starting new newspapers. I think he started the Banner Herald in Athens, and and actually started the Echo in Crawford, but didn't like the fact that people were raising goats right next to him, so he moved to Lexington. And of course, which also had the advantage of being a county seat. And back in those days, it wasn't a long trip to Crawford, where the train station was, but they had a track that ran from Crawford to Lexington to deliver things right there. So, but it was quite a trip to Athens, and so, of course, back then, Lexington was a trade center for the people that were just within walking distance of farms or with a mule and wagon distance of farms. So, Lexington could be a right busy place, before the Depression hit, which I think slowed things down a lot. But Dad often told me that he was working in a little grocery store on Main Street, Lexington, and he said he worked till midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning, because he said people worked till noon, then got paid for the week's work, and then came to town. So it didn't start getting busy at all till 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But then he said after that, as it got later, and some people have been drinking, some people have been not, but he said you had a hard time walking on the sidewalk. Most people walked in the street because the travel was, if you know Lexington today, and it's hard to believe this, but the sidewalk was so crowded, you didn't have room to get on the sidewalk. But so that's just another difference between now and then. But the Echo had for a paper that's been in existence for now, almost 150 years, it's had relatively few editors. That had Larry Gant, from the period from 1874 to 1980, when Mr. Shack, William W.A. Shackelford, took over. Mr. Shack, who also sold insurance and bicycles to make a living, but he was the editor, publishing editor from 1980 until 1943. 1880 to 1943. 43, so 63 years. And then he sold it to Amison, Wallace Amison, who, as Tom noted in his recent research, was also manager of the cheese factory at one time in Lexington. So anyway, and this was Dad's uncle, and so when Dad was, planning on taking his retirement from the Navy, and after having been in, 24 something years, he negotiated with his uncle about buying it, and his uncle agreed that he would stay on for a year or so to teach Dad the many nuances of letterpress printing. And so Dad agreed and retired, took his GI Bill, went to linotype school in Atlanta, where we lived for 6 months. Moving from Newport, Rhode Island, where I was born. But, and so Dad had been on the job for 19 days when Mr. Amison had a heart attack and died. So Dad knew how to run the linotype, but there was a whole lot about putting out the paper that he did not know, of course. And he compiled, I think, for historical before, back probably 25 years ago or so, this compilation of letterpress equipment that was.
Drop that, you done said you don't let it.
This here is just the beginning of a subscription list. So every week that was run out on yellow paper of all things, and it would be cut into strips the right width and put into this machine, which is something that I often ran. It was a wing mailer, and it's glue. This ran through this little brass container, which had glue on this end of it, a wooden roller, and then a thumb turn here, so that you advance the paper with this little thing, and then when it got to the right spot, you would slam it down on the paper, which would activate this blade that was on the end of the wing mailer, which would hopefully apply the label and the glue to the paper and the stick. And back in that was also another one of my jobs was, I was for 4 or 5 years anyway, was to run the wing mailer and attach labels and then carry them over to the post office. One day I was carrying over a stack of, I think Route 1 Lexington or whatever, to the post office. Come in.
Oh, this chair.
And as soon as I walked around the corner, a gust of wind hit me, and the top 4 or 5 papers flew off into wherever. And so I made carried them on down to Billy Bryan at the post office and told him what happened. He said, "Well, just go back and tell your dad." So I did. So I thought Dad would be furious, but he said, "No problem." He just ran up, picked up another one of these, made a proof of the mailing list, and we did the top 4 or 5 papers again, and I ran them over, well held down this time, to the post office, and no problem done. But later that week, someone came in and said, "Well, they appreciate you getting 2 papers out of it." They said one blew up in their feet, and the other one they got through the post office. One they got airmail, one they got through the post office. So, and of course, now everything is done inside of the computer, electronically, and it's emailed to the printing plant, and anywhere else you want to email it if you've got an email address. But back in the day, Dad spent many an hour on linotype, and of course, linotype was invented, in Germany, and was first available in 1884, and many, the Banner Herald, I don't know exact date, but Tom, do you remember when you thought that was?
I can't remember.
Yeah, 1890 something or 1900.
Maybe not, yeah.
Well, they invested in a linotype. But previous to the linotype thing, even the largest newspapers, I'm talking New York, Washington, D.C., they just had 8-page papers. I mean, the idea of writing a story, having it set one letter at a time, upside down and backwards, made into a form, and then, printed and distributed, even with a number of people setting type, 8 pages, it was about all any daily newspaper could get out in the country until the linotypes, hit. And then the big papers, William Randolph Hearst and others purchased, tens and hundreds of linotypes, and of course much expanded their ability to increase the size of the paper and to increase, have room for advertising, which is the main reason. So, and I think I mentioned earlier that it was 1917 when the Echo purchased its first linotype, and of course the first linotypes that were made were advertised to run without electricity, and they melted the lead with free Bunsen burners. So the linotype we have, of course, was wired to keep the lead above the 575 degrees. It had to be melted. And like I say, if any of you ever get the opportunity to see a linotype, I certainly take that opportunity to see it. You can buy, even today, a linotype. I think I've seen them on eBay for $1,200. I don't know what the running condition of the linotype is, but a linotype was, Dad's claim to fame in a Hallmark Hall of Fame movie. They showed his hands operating the keyboard for a linotype because whoever the main actor was couldn't, get out any kind of rhythm like it looked like he could possibly know what he was doing. So they just used Dad's hands and doing it for a Hallmark Hall of Fame movie they shot in the Echo to show the old press and to show the old linotype. But linotype was a marvel of machinery, and I think it must have had to have every moving part that was ever invented, every cam, every shaft, every gear, plus the lead melting pot that kept the lead above at 600 degrees or thereabouts to make sure that it could be poured in. At the top here is, you can see I got it down. Is a linotype that's created by the linotype, and what I passed around those little brass mats, and I don't know where they are now, and anybody has seen them. On the side of those are small ones, but that's a very small type, is a letter that's imprinted on the side. And so Dad would in a simple format, would hit a key, and from the font that was listed on the top of the machines there, or above the keyboard, would slide down the appropriate ramp and land in a little spot right beside to his left hand, and whatever. And then he'd do a whole line of type, and then insert space bands as necessary, although to make the line justify or to close out to the end, and then push down on another switch would carry those brass mats up to the, hit a switch which would cause hot lead to be mashed up against those brass mats and form a line of type. The indent would be where the letters were, and that would be put that in a galley, and hopefully with hundreds more have enough to do the composition for the newspaper that week. And you had probably 4 different fonts in a linotype that you could go to a 9-point or a 10-point or a bold or an italic of different types, and you had other things of fonts on occasion that you would change out on your linotype. But it was a process that was very, very tedious. Daddy often joked that he had a bottle of orange juice he kept on the windowsill right behind him on the linotype, and he said, well, if I was a real linotype operator, it'd be a bottle of liquor, because it could be frustrating enterprise to run a linotype, especially if it wasn't running well. And then so after the type was cast in that lead, it hit another switch, it would carry those brass mats back up to the top of the linotype and push them over on a cylinder, and those little keys at the top of the brass mats would go along, on the cylinder until it came to its correct slot, and then it would, the gear, it would line up on things so that the mat would fall down its slot and not continue on. So, which is the thing that always amazed me, that they can make those match up so well in the little different slots and indices on it, so that they didn't go down the wrong slot very often. Every now and then one would, but for one reason I don't know, but I never really understood how it could be that as accurate as it was with the linotype and sorting back the brass mats in the correct spot. So, and then that once the type was made up in the various galleys of type, you had sandstone tabletops, which had big metal forms all around, and then you had room for 4 pages in each form. So what you would do is what ads, if you had an ad, had many ads that weren't made up, just grocery ads, we would set large type. But I don't know if you'll be able to tell, this is a little piece of plastic type material here that you would mount on a piece of block wood, and then pour lead in around it, and it would form, from this item here, an ad. In the Georgia Power ad, Georgia Power would sometimes send in big ads. I mean, 10 or 12 inches high and 6 or 8 inches wide. And the same, and all they would send you was a little piece of paper like that you formed the ad out of hot lead and placed it in the paper. And of course, this type here is a small headline type. It's probably only 24, 30 point type, and the letters. This one's still got black ink on the letter, whatever that is there. You set that in headlines again, upside down and backwards, and you used slugs like this on the top here to separate the lines of type. And you also use slugs and a thinner thing called a lead when you were making up the form to make your type as tight as possible against the form. And once you got it as tight as you possibly thought you could, you would use a coin, which is an excellent crossword puzzle word, or a Scrabble word, which is that right there. You'd stick those in the margins, and then you had a coin wrench, and they would tighten up, so that your whole form, was hopefully as tight as could be, and you would lift it a dozen times just to make sure you didn't see any leads or slugs or type, slip, or seem to be loose. Then to get it to the press, you got a specialized cart called a turtle, which was, again, table height. It was manufactured to be the same height as a makeup table of sandstone, so that you could push it right up against the sandstone and then push the whole form onto that thing, which by that point probably weighed a couple 100 pounds, onto that turtle, and then you would slide the turtle over to the bed of the press and push the form off the turtle onto the bed of the press. And of course, this, printing was direct printing, which is one reason that, you've got a mirror image of the type that you set up, or the form that you made up. So that when since it was upside down and backwards, it was, right when it came out on a piece of paper. So, my most vivid memory of Dad in that press is, at one point, he didn't quite tighten up the things to lock in the form on the press enough, and after about 15 or 20 revolutions, the whole form slid off the press, and the corner of it went through the heart pine floor at the Echo, and so Dad, Mom, and Mr. T. Edward Carter, who was the extension service agent at the time in Oglethorpe County, and Dad's photographer, and who did his developed this film, spent, the next probably 5 or 6 hours trying to reassemble, some of the type that they had set up. It was in individual lines and headlines and one thing and another, and I think had to bring in John Harold Williams, a 65-year employee at the Echo from time to time, to make up another ad or two, set another ad or two, while Mom said it would probably be best for us to go out and play under the cottonwood tree for a while. I didn't think she wanted to expose our tender ears to what I thought might have been uttered in frustration. But about 1967 or 68, it became obvious to the owners of the Madisonian in Madison, Georgia, the Herald Journal in Greensboro, Georgia, the Tacoma News, the Gainesville Monitor in Madison County, Wilkes News Reporter in Washington, Georgia, and Daddy, that offset was on the way, and the linotypes and the old way of printing were on the way out. So they met, and at our house in Front Porch in Crawford, and decided that they were going to invest the princely sum or $5,000 each, and then borrow $50,000 from combined two banks. It was a little bit too much for one bank to want to invest that, and buy both a building and a offset press. So they did, and in 1969 they started printing in Crawford, and they had some dispute as to where this plant would be and where who would run it. And I don't think any of the others trusted each other, but most of them trusted Dad, so they allowed him to be the president and general manager of the Great Woods Printers, which technically was not and is still not any part of the Echo. It was a separate corporation, but since Dad was managing both the Great Woods Printers and the Echo, and did all the hiring and firing and whatnot, and allowed some of his employees to work at times at Great Woods Printers, we were sort of intimately, involved with each other. So, don't know if there's much. If you can see these in the early part, these little blocks up here were either standard ad cuts or just different items that you could stick in an advertisement or to pick up news, and you had regular stuff, which another good crossword thing is dingbats, and that's, the little decorative items you might use in a newspaper, which are done, but, and this item here was a planer which you ran over the top of the form before you put it on the press, to knock down and just try to make sure that the type was all just as level as you could get it, and nothing had been sort of pinched up a little bit higher. And if you can see and tell from here, I think they used something besides rawhide mallet that we always used to do it. On this was this, because I feel like Mr. Shack must have pounded on that a number of times himself, because it was completely worn out the middle of it. But so, like I say, that gets us to the more modern era, and when we were, then laying out composition, was on a slant, and you cut and paste, and you ran out type. We used started off with what was the name of them? Photomechanical CompuGraphics that were set up where you had a film strip with fonts on it and a computer code on the side and a light that would expose the letter on your type every time it hit the proper code. It would recognize the code beside the letter, and so then you could set type on a typewriter as fast as you could type. It was like I say, a dramatic improvement over the days that they either had to either second on the line to type or setting it by hand earlier. You know, it was just his speed of typing. The problem was that once you had to process this photographic film in the darkroom. It came in out in a light type cassette. You carry them in the darkroom and feed it through the thing. Hopefully, end up with a long string of very usable type, which you could read for corrections and make them so on. However, every so often, the processor wasn't quite as proficient as you'd hoped, and it would get wrapped around, and you lose 2 or 3 hours worth of typesetting through that. Then it progressed to having where you could, and we got a Radio Shack computer of all things, to interface with that CompuGraphic, and you could save your typing all on the disk on the Radio Shack, and then run it through the CompuGraphic, and so at least you wouldn't have to reset your type, if it got messed up. Previous to that is a period which I don't even enjoy thinking about at all. You could set type and punch a tape and run the tape through a thing to generate your type. And I never had to set any of that type, and I didn't have to really fool with the generator. But I remember that it was a tremendous amount of trouble. To generate that type. A lot of times with that tape would get off, would not be read correctly, and it was a frustrating experience as well. So, of course, then you came up with modern computers and programs in which you could set type, and everything turns out on a disk. You never saw any kind of copy until and you could do the pagination directly on the computer itself, and you never saw what a full page looked like until you got a copy from the printing plant. So those are the various iterations of printing, and of course, as being the world's worst advertising salesman, our saw and the pandemic, our advertising started declining. As the internet came full force, and Facebook was, a predominant form of communication, and the internet in general, advertising sales at the Echo declined precipitously, and it just became more expensive to keep things going, and not being able to really pay people what they were worth to work at a weekly newspaper. So I think the quality suffered in that regard as well. But and then I had a stroke in 2017, and I tried to keep on working for the next 4 or 5 years. But it became obvious to me that nobody was interested in purchasing the Echo, and no sound businessman would, because they were going out of business all over the country. Left and right. I think at this point there's at least 6,000 weekly newspapers that have gone out of business across the country in the last 7 or 8 years. And so Nick Smith, of course, is probably one of the most preeminent weekly newspaper owners in the country, because at one point he and his partner in community newspapers had 60-something newspapers spread generally across the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, even a few in Alabama, I believe. But and he had, of course, showed the good sense to move to Oglethorpe County, out on part of the old Kenny Rogers farm, where the brick barns were, and I, communicated with him, and he wrote a column for the paper as well, and so I knew he'd be interested, and knew that he wouldn't have any interest in purchasing, because he said a long time ago that the Echo just didn't fit the company's profile. It just wasn't enough activity or enough population of Oglethorpe County, or enough business to really support the kind of newspapers they tried to put out. But so he came down and of course was not happy to hear the news, just because he's such a big promoter of the newspaper business and has so much invested both financially and emotionally in newspapers. And so he said, well, said, I'll give you a check for $10,000 a day if you just hold off a month, and give me another month to figure something out. And I said, well, I didn't need $10,000 to last another month. It might be close, but anyway, I wouldn't take that. But so he left, and he called me, I think, the next day, and said he'd talked to Dean Davis at the university, and would I be interested in just, would the family be interested in donating the Echo to a nonprofit organization, which they would come up with a legal wherewithal to have the university use that nonprofit and the Oglethorpe Echo Legacy Incorporated to continue putting out a weekly newspaper, and that it would be sort of headquartered, or the work would often be mostly done at the university, and that they would still use the Echo for walking traffic and telephones and his office and part-time for the editor when he came down from other things. And so that's, in short, that's what worked out after a month's worth of finagling and lining up part-time interns, because it was in the middle of a semester. So of course, regular students weren't available to work out of their classes, but they were, they did agree to have a bridge group of interns that would provide the necessary copy and writing and whatnot until the middle of the January, when the next semester students would be available. And and that's the method that's been going on for the last, I guess, year and a half now, since the beginning of last November 1920. 2020. Now, any questions or any observations?
Where'd you get your newsprint from? The paper
Oh,
itself?
where it was cheapest at the time, anywhere from, there were several mills down in Augusta, I think one of them is closed up. Got some of it from Canada, especially when we were printing on 50-pound bond, something special or a heavier paper or other things. But and then in Dublin there was a factory that produced newspaper out of totally recycled paper. And a guy from Maxwell, Joe Corman, was actually in charge of that plant. We bought a good bit of newsprint from them as well. But they were, and then there were brokers who had made some kind of deals to get access to an overrun of newspaper of some size, or some weight, and we would buy some from a broker. We just bought newsprint wherever we could find it cheapest. John.
Mine's more of a statement. We lived, Nancy and I first got married it's about 74 to 91, about 2 blocks, a block from Echo. So I obviously saw y'all a great deal and everything. Well aware of how often you would go to ball games or different things, take pictures and write all the stories. And I see what's happened. There's no doubt that with university involvement, the amount of content has increased. I'm also looking at, they got 17 to 18 people doing this. And before, this was all done by you primarily.
Well,
I gotta give you a lot of credit.
Glenn was there, another writer.
But I'm saying it really brought home to me how much you contributed to life, that paper.
Well, it was just, the frustrating part was, it just really, with the limited staff, you just couldn't do the kind of job you hope to be able to do, and that I think the community deserved, and in many ways is much better served in the situation now. And no doubt in my mind, it's the happiest possible end for the Echo, because I was prepared to close it. And as many, and it's I think worth noting that the news reporter in the Lincoln Journal and the old town in South Carolina have combined newspapers, and so, you know, it's not really like any of them having their own hometown newspaper, but they still have something. But it's just the economic efficiency of being able to post your newspaper online as opposed to paying Great Georgia printers to print it and paying the post office to mail it. I think at Dink's last presentation I heard that, you know, his printing bill for that week was $650, $675, and the printing bill was $350. And of course, the guy from Greensboro called us up and said, we now figure out postage for everybody that we print on the newspaper through a program that they use as post office. And he said, I just can't, you know, I used to pay, and when we were doing that, it wasn't quite free to mail newspapers in the county, but it was darn close to it. I mean, they can, you know, say if you mailed, you had a newspaper, you know, authorization and the right code, you know, in the county, you could mail newspapers, you know, for practically nothing. But now, you know, that's gone as well. And like I say, the Greensboro paper called up and said, I just can't believe anybody's paying as much postage as I am. It's $450 this week. And we said, Junior, your paper's bigger and got more pages than the Echo pays $350. So it's just one of those things where the internet and Facebook basically probably killed the weekly newspaper business, because just most people, you know, prefer to be able to dial in to things they're specifically interested in, which is something the internet gives you. A newspaper is generally trying to deliver a broad spectrum of news to entertain as many eyeballs as they can. So, anyway. Any other questions?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to make a statement I think is a testament to your dad and the other editors of their foresight of what the printing was going to be is Greater Georgia Printers in Crawford. And people might not recognize how big of an operation that is and what they do, but they had the foresight for that business.
Well, like I said, I'd like to give them credit for foresight, but they were rapidly getting pushed up against the wall. But they had to do it themselves or pay somebody else to do it for them. And this is more or less centrally located between Madison and Washington, not quite, but so, you know, they were, you know, small town businessmen, and they didn't want to pay somebody else to do something they thought they could do themselves, more or less.
Yeah, what's the biggest local news that you remember in your career?
Probably when the guy was found halfway buried with his hand sticking out of a water trough down in White Sturgeon's property, and a murder trial that ensued from that. Of course, it was when they first started having marijuana fields. That was big news at the time, but of course now marijuana fields are halfway legal and not that big excitement anymore.
When that when Crawford blew up.
And the fire in Crawford, what now?
When Crawford blew up.
Yeah, Crawford blew up and took out parts of various other parts, but.
Can you tell a little bit how your dad gathered the news, the correspondence, and how, was it a one-person operation or what?
Oh, yeah, very much so. The only help he had was, you know, John Harrell, that for most of the time. He did have, you know, occasionally other things come up. But, yeah, Dad was pretty much a one-man operation, and he did have T.A. Ricardo that had a large format 2 1/4 film camera that would take pictures, and of course people submitted pictures. And that's one part that I left off. I mentioned that it was very rare to have pictures in the 1940s and 1950s because it was such a production. To begin with, you had to get film processed and a picture made. Then you had to send the picture off to get sort of a plastic piece of paper, piece of plastic with the dots on it that were really not very good quality, that you could attach to a tie-pie piece of block, which a tie-pie, I don't know how they came up with the measurements, is 0.918 3 inches or 23.3 millimeters inches. And I can't imagine how that was standardized forever, but that's, you know, tie-pie it is 0.9183 inches. So, which means all these letters here are, that's type I, a piece of type. So,
I have one comment. That hot lead may have messed up and made you have a stroke, but I think your brain is still functioning.
I'm sure it did a lot of damage, and that was one of my jobs, was when you broke, at the end of the week, you printed that paper, and of course, I mentioned making up the one form and slide it on, so that was one side of the paper. You printed 4 pages, that form was made into 4 pages that headed up, faced each other, and so at the end of the run, which probably took an hour and 15 or 20 minutes, you flip that stack over, put it back on top of the press, and then go to work on your other form to print the back side of those 4 pages, so you have an 8-page paper. And then the next day was the day you killed out. You took away all that type you had set, put it back into the lead smelter in the back, where I then melted it all out, and then scooped out with a little round shovel and put it in forms so that Dad would have 27-pound bars of lead to hang from chains over the melting pot in the linotype, so that he would have a constant supply of lead while running the linotype. So.
Of course, that recycling at that time. You didn't lose anything, you just kept melting it down.
Right. No telling how many times some of those slopes were melted down. And there was some element that you put in that would, because there was ink still, you'd wash it off, but there was ink still and dirt still on lead, that it would cause it to float to the top of the lead. But,
And this was without air conditioning, I presume.
Well, it was. It would get pretty hot in the old Echo at times, and the heat was provided by potbelly stove. So we were not really up to speed on some of the modern utilities.
I'm glad I wasn't in these.
Yes, sir.
Did the Echo, either in a positive or negative fashion, exert more than appropriate editorial influence? Meaning, did it push certain issues or
it's hard to
cause
but-
something?
But this was pre-social media. The Echo was, in a way, social media. At the first part of the life of the Echo, there wasn't even too much radio, much less television. So in the 1800s, and reading that, there was very lively discussions between, and Mr. Shack was, I've been informed, was the one in the state of Georgia that popularized the idea of community correspondence, that, people from at Oglethorpe County at that time had many more named communities, Little New York, or just like dozens of communities, because, people just weren't able to travel as much unless they were willing to hook up a buggy or ride a horse. They were usually within walking distance of their neighbors, depending on how large their farms were. But it was. I think, of course, there was much less literacy at that point. But I think the paper was probably the best well read at any time in its history. During that period after Reconstruction and before World War I, that just because there was no television to watch, there was very little radio to listen to, and not everybody had radios, but most people could either get it in an Echo, $1 a year for subscription at that point if he wasn't having a special. And despite Mr. Shack's observations that neither a borrower nor a lender be, most people did just loan out their Echoes when they run them to the next door neighbors. So, and he often had rather sizable ads in the paper suggesting that people should not share their
What was the Echo's position, if any, on major issues like prohibition?
Well, as Mr. Shack both his benefit and his disgraces certainly reflected whatever the prevailing mood was at the time. He was a big supporter of Jim Crow issues, and going back and reading some of the old papers had terribly racist positions on things, and I think he followed the Baptist preachers and the moonshiners and was all in favor of prohibition, because alcohol was an evil drink, and and he wanted to keep the preachers happy. So, I wouldn't. His political positions at the time were, followed very closely. I think that what he believed that the general white population in the county would be. And of course, the white I found it interesting that he purchased the linotype in 1917 when Oglethorpe County was probably approaching its highest ever population, which was 1920. In 1920, I think it had approximately 20,000 people in the county, Tom.
Wow.
And it declined every census in the decade since that time till the 1960s. So, of course, very patriotic. Was supported Jim Smith wholeheartedly when he ran for governor, when he had things. Dad's editorial position was probably most known when he happened to get Mom fired from the school system, because he wrote an editorial about the superintendent having checks that weren't cashed in his office, which Mom has alerted me to, and other shortcomings, and pushing to have an elected superintendent, which happened shortly after, not too long after that.
So that was Boed that had the checks?
Yes.
And he didn't fire her, he just almost fired her.
Well,
And she ended up as principal, I remember.
he was, what happened is the Board of Education agreed that they would switch to to an appointed superintendent, with the idea that that the most qualified person could be elected. And of course, I think they knew that Ed was nearing his end of time anyway, just because of his age. But that is what I think precipitated it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'm going to remind you of something. It goes to Glenn's statement. When Jake Griffith was in trouble back in the 80s, late 80s, you credited the Old Edwards Road getting paved to the election, and Jake wanted to curry favor with you at the time. And I appreciate the road being paved.
That was about the same time I got my free driveway.
There are a lot of free driveways.
Yeah. And the gravel.
Yeah.
That's what I need, six loads of gravel. It's
I
not
know, I
filled.
know.
How much anyway for blades?
This is fascinating, and I'm very happy about the outcome of the solution that you and Deacon and others came up with for the continuation of the Echo's legacy. My question is does the university incorporate into their curriculum exactly this kind of presentation from time to time, with you as a visiting professor?
I might refer that to Andy Johnston back there, who's the current editor. And not only is this certainly one of the founders of the Athens Observer, and he now runs Vietnam as a hobby.
Lives in Vietnam as a hobby.
So, is Ralph invited to the university? Is that what you're asking? Or did we bring students to Ralph?
Yeah, from time to time, it seems to me this would be an asset for the students.
I don't think we've had a set meeting where students come to Ralph, but I know Ralph has been interviewed by students from time to time for various stories, either about the Echo or about Oglethorpe County. We have a student here in this current capstone class, Alex is here, and he is writing a story for tonight, correct? So Ralph is certainly a big part of what we do with the students at Grady.
And for the first 6 months, I was probably more in attendance at the Echo than I was the previous 6 months, just because I knew that they would probably have a lot of questions, and I'd spend a lot of time, and Jessica would work with me and spend a lot of time trying to compile story lists and backgrounds on issues we thought would be coming up.
Yeah, Ralph and Jessica made the transition incredibly easy in that they gave us story ideas, they gave us contact lists. I went and talked to Ralph before I was brought in, and we talked for an hour and a half one day, I think.
I mean, and Dink is always open, you know, back to try.
There were many other phone calls, but just one day before I got started, I'm like, just fill me in with everything that's going on here, because I actually don't live in Oglethorpe County, I live in Coney County, but I don't want y'all to boo Coney. We know Oglethorpe does not want to be a Coney. Coney has a saying that we want to become Gwinnett. So I can see where it comes passing down. But Ralph's been great. He actually kept a nice, big, comfortable chair in the Echo lobby that he could come in and sit, you know, and sort of be like Santa Claus, and we could all gather around him. I think we moved the chair out eventually.
I moved, the chair got moved to Cashiers, North Carolina.
Okay, so I'm sure he's got a much better scenery now, but Ralph has been a great resource to me and to the Echo students throughout this time, and like you said, the first 6-9 months of me coming in, we talked and texted and
Every
day almost, every week, definitely.
I mean, you know, because I had been there 40 years and just knew a little more background, and so it's been there weeks is all. And he's certainly done a good job and is an excellent editor, much better editor than I ever was, because if we could just get the story, I was just looking to get the story finished.
What they can't bring to it is Ralph's knowledge of everybody that's lived in this county for the past 100 years. And we miss that. I mean, we're so grateful. And I'm so glad that Alex is here tonight and Andy's here tonight. And that was wonderful. I was going to ask, you know, this is the first time we've tried anything like this. And I thought I would ask, if anybody has an idea of other people you'd like to bring in, we could do this. But now I kind of want to just have you come back like once a month and tell us some gossip. We just want to tell gossip.
Just come to the Rain and Rooster on Saturday night.
I do that too.